So we're going to take a look at alternation of generations in certain species of organisms, and all organisms undergo alternation of generations because really what that means is during a certain part of the life cycle, cells will be haploid, and during another part of the life cycle, cells will be diploid, and certain cells are formed through meiosis, that would be our gametes of course, and certain cells are formed through mitosis, that would be all of our somatic cells, any cells other than our gametes. And so when we talk about alternation of generations, then it specifically is that cycling between diploid and haploid phases, that cycling between mitosis and meiosis in an organism's life cycle. So when we take a look at interpreting these diagrams on alternation of generations, really what we're going to be looking at are mosses and ferns because they're quite primitive plants, and we're going to be taking a look at some invertebrate species. The example I have in here is a jellyfish. So when it comes to alternating through diploid and haploid phases, remember that all organisms do that. It's just a bit more complex in those primitive plants and in some of those lower less developed animals, okay? So as more complex plants evolved through evolutionary history, the diploid stage actually became dominant. So that means that the organism spent most of its life cycle in that diploid dominant stage, okay? So either growing or living out its life as an adult organism, etc. The gametophyte, which was the structure of the plant that actually produces gametes, became smaller and limited in size. And then we also ended up with sporophytes becoming photosynthetic. So they actually were nutritionally independent of the main plant, okay? So the key concept in terms of alternation of generations, what we are going to be asked to be able to do is you have to be able to determine, looking at a diagram, are the cells diploid or are they haploid? Is meiosis occurring or is mitosis occurring? And when is fertilization happening and what is the end result of fertilization? So one really important thing to remember is if we're talking about meiosis, please keep in mind that this is always reduction division, okay? This is always the reduction of ploidy so that we end up with haploid gametes. That's what meiosis is all about. So if it's a diploid organism, we're going from 2n to n. If it's a tetraploid organism, we're going from 4n to 2n, but it's always reduction division in meiosis, okay, reducing that chromosomal number. When it comes to fertilization, please remember that this is the characteristic of sexually reproducing organisms. This involves gametes. This is when egg and sperm unites, and therefore our ploidy is actually going to double, because when egg and sperm unite, we go from haploid to diploid, or in the case of a tetraploid organism, we go from 2n to 4n. So just make sure that we kind of remember that fertilization always results in twice the number of chromosomes because egg has been fertilized by sperm. The last thing is mitosis, and the important thing to remember about mitosis is we always have conservation of ploidy. So as cells divide, whether it's skin cells or plant cells or whatever the case is, as these cells divide, as long as they aren't gametes, ploidy is conserved, okay? So any cells that reproduce through mitosis, the end game is to keep that ploidy the same. So if it's a diploid organism, we're going from 2n to 2n. If it's a tetraploid organism, we're going from 4n to 4n. And you'll notice here we also have something a little bit unusual where we have haploid going to haploid. And we'll talk about that a little bit later because that is unique to certain species. But in any case, mitosis always involves the ploidy being conserved, regardless of whether we're talking about 2n, n, or 4n. The other thing is remember what mitosis is for. Mitosis is to grow an organism. Okay, it's for growth, it's for introduction of new tissues, it's for replacing damaged cells, old cells, and primarily, as I said, for growth. So moving along to some of our diagrams here, now we can see that we're looking at just kind of a general alternation of generations diagram here. So this is quite general. But what we always want to look at is we want to look at the ploidy, and we want to look at where is meiosis happening, where is mitosis happening, and what is happening when we have fertilization. So we can kind of start at any point in time here. So maybe a good place to start is with fertilization, because most of us kind of are comfortable with what that means at this stage of the game. So remember that fertilization involves the union of the egg and the sperm, and as a result, we end up with a zygote, which is diploid, right? Because both of the egg and sperm are haploid, and so we end up with a diploid zygote. And as that zygote cleaves and divides, etc., we are still diploid, okay, once we get to the sporophyte, which again is just a certain phase in the development of the plant. And another important thing to remember is this is mitosis happening here, right? Because you'll notice that the ploidy is being conserved, right? Because we're going from 2N to 2N to 2N, okay, and up here again 2N, so ploidy is being conserved. So on this bottom half of the diagram, we are always diploid, and growth is happening through mitosis once fertilization happens. So you'll notice that the sporophyte grows into something called a sporangia, and then into what we call a spore mother cell. So sporangia actually produce spores, and then as those mother cells mature, and notice that they are still diploid at this point, as those mother cells mature, then they actually are capable of undergoing meiosis. So that spore mother cell undergoes meiosis in order to produce those haploid cells called spores. Okay, so the spore mother cell is diploid, but here we can see that we're undergoing meiosis to produce those little spores. And keep in mind that meiosis always results in reduction of ploidy. So that's why we now have haploid cells. So anywhere that you see meiosis, please remember that this is a haploid cells being produced, and we're always going to be reducing that ploidy. So now we have all of these little haploid spores, and then what happens, and this is something very unique to primitive plants, is that little spore, which is haploid, remember, is going to grow into a structure, a plant structure called the gametophyte. And if you take a look here, gametophyte, the prefix there is gameto. And so that's a hint that that is actually going to produce gametes, okay? And here's where sometimes kids get a little bit confused, is they're like, okay, if this is producing gametes, why do we not have a further reduction of ploidy? And the reason is because the gametophyte is already haploid, okay? So remember back down here, that spore mother cell was the cell that underwent meiosis to produce those haploid spores. So as those spores are maturing, and eventually growing into that gametophyte, we still are haploid. So the gametophyte will literally have two versions of itself. It'll have a gametophyte that produces eggs, and it'll have other versions of the gametophyte that will produce sperm, okay? It just says one gametophyte there, but we'll actually have a male version and a female version, both of which are haploid, so they will produce haploid cells. The female gametophytes producing eggs, and the male gametophytes producing sperm. And then the life cycle continues. Egg and sperm unite, we have fertilization, and then back to our diploid zygote. So again, the big takeaway here is, what is the result of fertilization? Okay, what's the result of fertilization? Where do we have diploid? Where do we have haploid? Where is meiosis happening? And where is mitosis happening? That's what we have to be able to do for all of these diagrams. Now, if we take a look at our next slide here, we'll take a look at mosses, and these again have a slightly different life cycle than the ferns and the jellyfish, etc. So let's kind of find our fertilization again here as our starting point, because again, that's just a good place to start when we're trying to figure out these diagrams, because pretty much everybody knows that fertilization means union of egg and sperm, and now we have a zygote. And so when we're thinking about ploidy, remember that the zygote is always going to be diploid, right? Because we have that union of egg and sperm. So once fertilization happens, we have a little zygote in here that is diploid, and it's going to start to grow. And remember, because this is growing, right? So we're going to have mitosis, because you can see growing, and it's growing, and it's growing, right? All along here, we have this little zygote continuing to grow, continuing to grow, continuing to grow. Now, one thing that you'll notice here that is a little bit different is we have something called an archegonium, and an archegonium will actually produce eggs, okay? And so that's why we have this little haploid thing in here, because the archegonium is going to actually produce egg cells. And that's why when we get over here, we have kind of a dual structure here. So we have the stalk, the cells that are in the stalk here being diploid, and then we have the little egg-producing archegonium down here, which is haploid. So what ends up happening then is the mature sporophyte is going to pop open, and it's going to release the little spores. And just like in our previous slide, remember we saw that mother spore? So the same thing, you're going to have these mother spore cells that come out of this sporangium, so these mother spore cells that come out of the popped capsule here, and then those mother spore cells, they are going to undergo meiosis to actually produce little teeny tiny haploid spores. Okay, so remember, because we're undergoing meiosis, remember that is always reduction division, always. So we're going to end up with little teeny tiny spores that are haploid in nature. And then notice we have mitosis here again, and that's because those little spores are growing. Yes, they're haploid, doesn't matter. They're growing. They're growing into rhizoids, and then eventually they're growing into these gametophytes again. And remember we talked about that, gametophytes? Anytime you see gametophyte, doesn't matter if it's for a fern or a moss or whatever it is always, always, always going to have that prefix gamete because it produces gametes. So then we can see that we have the male that is producing male gametes, and then notice we also have a female version of the gametophyte which is going to produce female gametes. Okay, so our female produces the eggs, still haploid, our male produces the sperm, still haploid, and then the cycle starts over again. So again, it's all about identifying where do we have diploid, where do we have haploid, where do we have mitosis, where do we have meiosis. So looking at another example here of the ferns, you can see that it's very similar in terms of what's happening where, but the structures are a little bit different because it's a different species of plant. So again, let's find our fertilization as our starting point here, because as always, we know that we're going to have egg and sperm uniting to produce a diploid cell. So now we have our zygote, which we know is diploid because our egg and our sperm have united to form that zygote. And then notice that that little zygote is growing. And so because we have growth, this is mitosis, right? So it's growing into an embryo, and then it's growing into this little gametophyte, and then eventually it's going to grow into this, what we call an adult sporophyte. Now, if you look underneath the frond of the leaf, if you've ever seen that before, you'll see that there's these little, almost like, look like little capsules, and inside those little capsules are little sporangium, okay? So sporangium is just like the little, what is inside the little spore that is inside. We don't call it a spore yet because it's still diploid. So remember, we still have a diploid situation here because meiosis hasn't happened yet, okay? This has all been mitosis because it's all been growth of the structures. And then what ends up happening is, just like in our previous slide with the mosses, we have those mother spores, okay? Remember, we have those mother spores, and remember, those mother spores are still diploid, but what they are going to do is they are going to undergo meiosis to produce the haploid spore cells, right? Haploid spore cells. And then those little haploid spore cells are growing. And so because they're growing, we again have mitosis, right? So mitosis is all about the plant growth, because you can see those little spores are growing, and then eventually they're growing into this bigger structure called a gametophyte, okay? And there it is again, it's a gametophyte. And on this particular type of plant, which is a fern, there are actually sperm producing cells and female producing cells, okay, both of them. So the antheridium producing the sperm cells and the archegonium producing the egg cells. Now again, these are haploid, okay? They're gametes, they're eggs and sperm. So just what's different here is this gametophyte version, or part of the generation, is actually capable of producing eggs and sperm. So eggs and sperm cells are produced, and then we continue again with fertilization, and the cycle continues. So once again, kiddos, it's all about where is there mitosis, where is there meiosis, when are we haploid, when are we diploid. So the last example that we'll take a look at is one of the few animals that actually undergoes this type of alternation of generations. So let's just take a look here at our little jellyfish here. So here's just an actual image of the colony of polyps, and we'll kind of take a look at how that life cycle works. So once again, kiddos, let's look for fertilization. Here we go. So we know that anywhere that there's fertilization happening, we end up with a zygote. And what is the ploidy of the zygote? Because we've had union of egg and sperm, it's going to be diploid. I hope you said diploid. It's going to be diploid. And then notice what's happening here. The little zygote is dividing. It's becoming a little embryo. Then it's growing into a little developing polyp. So it's growing, 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 growing. As we said, what's happening here? What's happening when we're growing and we're conserving our ploidy because we are still diploid here? That, of course, is going to be mitosis. All of these cells are 2N and they continue to replicate themselves in the 2N form. So again, we still have mitosis, we still have mitosis, we still have mitosis as these polyps are maturing. And then what happens is we, instead of having the spores, we actually have what's called a medusa bud. And the medusa bud is a reproductive polyp. So there's more than one type of polyp on these jellyfish. So there's the feeding polyps, which, as the name implies, are for getting nutrition, right? And for the plant to, or sorry, for the jellyfish to sustain itself. And then we also have these reproductive polyps. And so once the reproductive polyp is mature enough, it's called a medusa bud. And then that medusa bud will pop off or bud off. And then I want you to notice what is in this little medusa bud here. It has that little word gonad, okay? And we know what gonads do. Gonads are responsible for producing gametes. So this medusa structure here, okay, the little jellyfish medusa structure there is responsible for the production of eggs and sperm. So in that little medusa, there actually are male producing gonads, or sorry, male gonads that produce male gametes and gonads that produce female gametes. And so then we can see we are undergoing meiosis. And remember, meiosis is always about reduction division. So now we are going from diploid, right? And we are going to haploid, right? As those eggs and sperm are produced, and then we continue through fertilization. So that, my dears, is alternation of generations. Again, the big takeaway is that you have to be able to identify when is mitosis happening, when is meiosis happening, and what is the ploidy at the various stages of the organism's life cycle.